Viktor Frankl spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. He lost his wife, his parents, his brother. He lost the manuscript he had spent years writing. He lost practically everything it was possible to lose. And when he got out, he wrote one of the most important books of the 20th century. Not about what was done to him, about what he chose to do with what was done to him. Frankl wrote, "The last of human freedoms is the choice of one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances." This video starts here, not with judgment, not with the message that you need to be strong all the time or that your pain isn't real. It is. What happened to you matters. What hurt you was real. But there is a difference, subtle, important, and sometimes difficult to face, between being a person who has suffered hard things and being a person who has organized their identity around that suffering. Between acknowledging genuine pain and using that pain as a permanent explanation for everything that doesn't work in your life. That difference has a name. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore it, carefully, honestly, and with the respect this topic deserves. Before anything else, we need to make a distinction that this kind of conversation frequently ignores, and that, when ignored, makes the entire argument sound cruel. There is genuine vulnerability. And there is victimhood. They are not the same thing. And confusing the two is one of the biggest mistakes one can make when talking about this subject. Genuine vulnerability is acknowledging that you were hurt, that certain experiences left marks, that you carry the weight of things you didn't choose, that asking for help is not weakness, that crying, feeling, processing pain is necessary and healthy. That is not victimhood, that is humanity. Victimhood is different. It's when the narrative of suffering stops being a point of passage, something you move through, and becomes a point of arrival. A place where you live, an identity that organizes how you interpret the world, how you relate to people, and above all, how you explain your own life to yourself. Carl Jung said that the human psyche seeks coherence above all else. It prefers a consistent narrative, even a limiting one, to no narrative at all. And the victim narrative has a powerful coherence. It explains everything. The job that never came, the relationship that didn't work, the dream that never materialized. Everything finds its explanation in what others did, in what fate denied, in the unfavorable circumstances. The problem with that coherence is the price it charges. And that price, as we'll see, is steep. Jung spent decades studying the patterns people repeat without realizing it. And one of the most common, and most difficult to see in yourself, is what he called identification with the complex. A complex in Jungian psychology is not necessarily something pathological. It's a set of memories, emotions, and beliefs organized around a central theme. We all have complexes. The problem is when you don't have the complex has you. When the victim identity becomes an active complex, something specific happens. You begin to perceive the world through the filter of that complex. Neutral situations seem like attacks. Well-intentioned people seem like threats. Opportunities seem like traps. The entire world begins to confirm the narrative, not necessarily because it's true, but because the filter only lets through the information that confirms it. Jung called this the confirmation of the complex. And what makes this mechanism so difficult to break is that it's unconscious. You don't wake up in the morning and decide to interpret everything as evidence that the world is against you. The filter operates beneath consciousness, silently, coloring every experience before you have a chance to examine it. Jordan Peterson, in his work on responsibility and order, makes an observation that unsettles a lot of people, precisely because it touches on something true. He says that the victim mentality offers something that is genuinely appealing: exemption from responsibility. If what happens to me is always a consequence of what others did, of the system that oppresses me, of the circumstances that held me back, then I'm not responsible. And not being responsible feels at first lighter than being responsible. But Peterson points to the other side of that coin. Along with responsibility, you also lose agency. If everything that happens to me comes from the outside, then there is nothing I can do to change it. I am at the mercy of others. I am waiting for the world to change so that my life can get better. And the world, with all the clarity of the universe, rarely changes in the direction the waiting person needs. Peterson is not saying that injustices don't exist. He is the first to acknowledge that they do, that they are real, that some people carry burdens they didn't choose, and that aren't their fault. What he is saying is that even in the face of genuinely unjust circumstances, the most powerful question you can ask is not why did this happen to me, but what do I do from here? Let's talk about how to identify victimhood in yourself, because this is the most delicate part and the most important. Nobody likes to see themselves as someone who plays the victim. Most people who operate in this pattern genuinely don't realize they're in it, and part of the reason is that victimhood rarely shows up by that name. It shows up disguised as other things. The first disguise is chronic complaining. There is a difference between processing a difficulty by talking about it, which is healthy, and turning the complaint into a default mode of conversation. When you notice that most of your conversations revolve around what's wrong, what people did, what isn't working, without any of it leading to action or resolution, it's worth asking yourself, is this conversation helping me process or helping me stay? The second disguise is the constant comparison with others as evidence of injustice. He has more luck. She had opportunities I never had. It's easy for them. It's never easy for me. Comparison isn't necessarily victimhood. Sometimes it's just information. But when comparison systematically serves to confirm that you're at a disadvantage, and that disadvantage is the reason for where you are, it has become a tool of imprisonment. The third disguise is difficulty receiving feedback. When someone offers a different perspective on a situation, the person in the victim pattern will often interpret it as an attack or a lack of understanding. You don't know what I've been through. You weren't there. It's easy for you to say. The feedback, even when well-intentioned, threatens the coherence of the narrative. So the system rejects it. The fourth disguise is the self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect things to go wrong. When they do, it confirms what you already knew. When they go right, there's an explanation. It was luck. It was an exception. It won't last. The narrative remains intact regardless of the outcome. Did you recognize any of these patterns in yourself? If so, that's not a reason for judgment. It's a starting point. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations something that seems almost brutal in its clarity. You have the power to have no opinion about a thing and not to let it disturb your soul, for things in themselves have no natural power to force our judgments. Read that again, slowly. He is not saying that difficult things don't happen. He was the emperor of Rome in a time of wars, plagues, and constant betrayal. He knew very well that hard things happen. What he is saying is that between the event and the suffering, there is a space, and in that space lives interpretation. And interpretation, unlike the event, belongs to you. This is not the denial of pain. It is the recognition that pain and the meaning you assign to it are two different things. Pain is often not a choice. Meaning always is, even when it doesn't feel that way. Victimhood is, in the end, a choice of meaning. The choice to interpret what happened as proof that you have no power, that the world is against you, that your situation is permanent and unchangeable. And like every choice of meaning, it can be remade. Now let's talk about the cost, because victimhood is not free. It has a real, concrete cost that is paid over time, and that many people only recognize when they take the most honest accounting of their own lives. The first cost is stagnation. When the dominant narrative is that external circumstances are responsible for your situation, there is no reason to change what is within your reach. Why develop new skills if the market is unfair anyway? Why work on communication if people always misunderstand me? Why try again if it always goes wrong? Victimhood justifies immobility. And immobility, over time, creates exactly the stagnation the narrative predicts. The second cost is isolation. Healthy relationships require reciprocity. They require both people to feel seen, heard, present. When one person is consistently in the victim role, where their suffering is always greater, where the focus is always on what was done to them, where any attempt to offer a different perspective is rejected, the weight on the relationship grows, and the people around them, as much as they care, eventually pull away, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. The third cost is the loss of real identity. Jung observed that when a person strongly identifies with a complex, the other dimensions of their personality, their capabilities, their values, their dreams, fade into the background. You stop being a complex person, full of possibility, who went through hard things. And you become, in your own narrative, mainly someone who suffered. And that reduction, over time, is one of the quietest forms of loss there is. The fourth cost, and perhaps the deepest, is time. Every year lived in the victim pattern is a year not spent building, not spent growing, not spent moving toward what you genuinely want and can become. Time doesn't come back. And the honest accounting of how much time has already been handed over to a narrative that no longer serves you is for many people the most painful and most liberating moment at the same time. Let's talk about roots. Because victimhood rarely comes from nowhere, and understanding where it comes from is essential to leaving it behind with compassion, not judgment. Jung observed that many adult patterns originate in childhood experiences that were traumatic or simply too confusing for the child to process alone. A child who grew up in an environment where their feelings were not validated learns that they need to amplify the pain to be heard. A child who was consistently held responsible for things that were not their fault may develop a hypersensitivity to injustice that persists into adult life. A child who watched the adults around them use suffering as a way to obtain love and attention learns that this is a strategy that works. These learnings are not conscious choices. They are adaptations, emotional survival strategies that made sense in a particular context, and that kept operating long after that context had changed. Understanding this is not an excuse to remain in the pattern. It is compassion for the path that brought you here. And compassion, paradoxically, is often what opens the space for the change that judgment can never produce. Peterson has a line I'll use here carefully, because it can sound harsh out of context, but it points to something genuinely liberating. He says, "Take responsibility for your life. You may know more than you think you do." What he is pointing to is that radical responsibility, assuming you have more power over your situation than the victim narrative allows you to recognize, is not a punishment. It is the recognition that you are an agent, that your choices matter, that what you do from now on carries real weight in determining where you will end up. And there is something profoundly dignifying in that. Because the alternative, believing that you are fundamentally a product of your circumstances, that what happens to you is always outside your control, is, at its core, believing that you are not a subject in your own story. You are merely an object of what others do. Radical responsibility does not deny that bad things happened. It does not minimize real injustices. It says, regardless of what happened, the next step is mine. The interpretation is mine. The direction from here is mine. And that, when you truly embrace it, is one of the most powerful forms of freedom there is. Marcus Aurelius returned repeatedly, in his meditations, to a practice the Stoics called procheiron, having at hand, available for immediate use, the principles that guide action. One of the principles he revisited most was this: distinguish what is in your power from what is not. What happened in the past, not in your power. What others did, not in your power. How the world received you, not in your power. What is in your power, how you interpret what happened, what you do with that interpretation, who you choose to be from today forward, what kind of person you are building with the decisions you make right now. This distinction, practiced consistently, begins to create something that victimhood silently steals, a sense of agency, the feeling that you have a rudder, that your choices carry weight, that you are not merely a passive receiver of what the world decides to do with you. Let's talk about how to leave this pattern. With concrete steps, not philosophical abstractions. The first step is observation without judgment. Before changing anything, you need to see the pattern clearly. For 1 week, observe, without criticizing yourself, the moments when you assign external responsibility for what you're experiencing. Not to punish yourself, to know the terrain. Jung said that making the unconscious conscious is already half the work. The second step is the redirecting question. Every time you notice the victim thinking is active, this always happens to me, nobody understands me, the system is against me, pause and ask a different question. What is in my power here? It may be small. It may be just the interpretation. But there is always something. And finding that something, however small, begins to rebuild the muscle of agency. The third step is the alternative narrative. Peterson suggests an exercise that seems simple but is powerful. Write your story from the perspective of someone who overcame the same circumstances. Not to deny what was difficult, but to see that the same story can be told in completely different ways. And the way you tell your story to yourself determines in large part what you believe is possible for you. The fourth step is to seek real support. Not validation of the suffering, which is what the victim pattern seeks and which perpetuates the cycle, but support that challenges you constructively. A therapist who doesn't just validate but also expands. People in your life who care about you enough to tell you difficult things with care. Communities where the focus is on growth, not on the exchange of suffering narratives. The fifth step, and the most continuous, is the practice of radical gratitude. Not the surface-level gratitude of a list of good things. The gratitude that recognizes that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is something that is yours. There is capacity that no one can take away. There are choices available. There is a next step possible. This gratitude does not deny the pain. It coexists with it. And that coexistence is exactly what Frankl described in the camps. The possibility of finding meaning even where everything has been taken. Jung wrote something I want to leave with you before we close. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Read that slowly. Once more. This is not a denial of the past. It is an affirmation of the future. It is the recognition that your story does not end with what was done to you. It continues with what you do from here. This is the difference between being a character in your story and being its author. Between living in the chapter of what happened and writing the next one. And here is what needs to be said with full clarity and full care. You deserve to be the author. Not because your pain wasn't real, it was. Not because what happened to you was fair. Perhaps it wasn't. But because you are more than what happened to you. You always were. And recognizing that, truly recognizing it, not just intellectually but viscerally, is the beginning of a life that is not organized around the past but directed toward the future. Frankl ended man's search for meaning with an observation that resonates like few things I have ever read. He said that the concentration camp showed that a human being can be stripped of everything, except one thing. The last human freedom. The freedom to choose one's own attitude. You probably haven't gone through what Frankl went through. But the freedom he is describing is available to you in the same way it was available to him. In any circumstance, in any story, at any point along the way. This freedom is not automatic. It is chosen, every day, sometimes several times in the same day. But it exists, and it is yours. If this video gave you something to think about, about yourself, about patterns you recognized, about a perspective you hadn't considered before, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.